Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next webinar in our Desktop Migrator series, Money Out. My name is Jenna Wright, and I'll be your instructor for the next hour. This webinar is really designed for people who are transitioning to QuickBooks Online, who already use Desktop, and who just want to learn more about the Money Out workflows and options in QuickBooks Online. Since you already know where everything is in Desktop, we are going to learn about several things that'll make this transition a little bit easier. First, we're going to learn how to organize our vendors. Now, reminder, vendors are the people we pay, the people we buy things from. We're going to learn how to find the vendors list in QBO, as well as discuss features that are unique to QBO on the vendors list. We'll also learn how to bring in some data and customize that vendors list for you. We'll also learn how to record your money out transactions. You already know how to record things like checks, bills, and credit card charges in Desktop, so we'll see what's the same and what's different in QBO. We'll also briefly talk about online banking and how it can help. And again, there are key differences between Desktop and online there, but it's all about keeping your expenses in order. And last but not least here, we'll learn how to examine reports, because what's the result of putting all this good data into QuickBooks? Reports. That is the heart of our company there. So we will talk about reports, especially helpful reports for money out and customization options available within them. Plus, we'll cover plenty of other tips and tricks along the way, and we'll be answering your questions. Now, there are infinite reasons why you migrated to QBO, and the biggest difference between Desktop and QBO is just that things are in a different place. So let's go ahead and jump right into Desktop, the thing you're already familiar with. And I'm actually going to turn off my camera to give you a little bit more screen real estate so you're not seeing my picture take up a big portion of the screen. So goodbye for my face, but my voice will still be here talking about QuickBooks. Here in Desktop, our money out transactions really can be found on the homepage. We know how to enter bills, and if we follow our workflow, we know how to pay bills. We know how to use the right checks window, and we know how to enter credit card charges. We also know where to find our vendors. From the homepage, I can select to open the vendor center. And here on the left-hand side of our screen is the vendors list, where we can also see any vendor-related transactions. How does QBO handle all of this? Let's open it up and take a look. And quick note here, I am in something called the accountant's view. That puts my nav bar in a very specific order here on the left-hand side of our screen. If you click the gear icon, if you have an option that says switch to accountant view and you're watching this webinar and want your screen to look like my screen, just select that option that says switch to accountant view. If you have switched to business view, that means your screen already looks like mine. Great. So the nav bar is where everything is stored in QBO. And we can specifically clue into what's happening with our money out by selecting expenses. And this is sort of the home for all things money out. Expenses here, this first tab that we see, shows us a bunch of money out transactions that we've recorded, as well as key details about those transactions. It's kind of just a hub to show you those money out transactions that you've saved in your books. The next tab over, though, vendors, this is where we can access the vendors list. And we can see we've got a big list of our different vendors, the people we spend money with, as well as general information about them. Now, obviously, this looks a little bit different than Desktop, but there are a few key differences here I want to point out. First, when you open up the vendors list, you'll notice you don't see transactions. You just see general information about your vendors, like their phone numbers and their email. Now, this might sound like a negative at first, but I'll show you how you can turn this vendors list into looking just like Desktop in a second. The second thing I want to point out here is at the top of your screen, you'll see this big money bar with all these different clickable colors. These are filters that you can apply to narrow down the vendors you see on this list. For example, if I click on open bills, this just shows me vendors that have open bills. Or if I were to click on overdue, I would just see vendors that have overdue bills or are bills that are overdue with our vendors. So you can use these filters to quickly and easily narrow down what you're looking for on your vendors list. And to take it back to normal, select Clear Filter, View All there at the top of your screen. Now, to add a new vendor into QuickBooks, you will see a big New Vendor button here on the right-hand side. This is where we can enter all details about our vendors. Now, the only required field here, the only field that we have to put data into is this one that says display name as. But you'll notice there's a lot else you can track for your vendors, like personal information, email, phone number. You can even add an address. Or for example, let's say your vendor is actually a subcontractor and you need to issue them a 1099. You can do that in QBO. Simply check this checkbox that says track payments for 1099 and go ahead and enter that person's social security number or business ID, and QBO will allow you to track their payments for a 1099 as well. There is quite a lot that you can track for your vendors, which is a really good thing. But another really common question I get, besides how do we add vendors to QuickBooks, how can we take away a vendor? Well, in QBO, you can't delete your vendors, but you can make them inactive. You'll notice this button at the bottom of the vendor information window. Or if you don't have a balance with the vendor and you select in the action drop-down column, you'll be able to see the option to make them inactive right here from the vendors list. Now, when you migrate directly from desktop to QBO, your vendors are already going to be in here. That direct migration populates all of your lists in QBO. But maybe you made the choice to switch from desktop to online without migrating directly, and instead just signed up for a brand new QBO company file that's blank. That's totally fine. Or maybe you want to do some cleaning up here and want to add a bunch of vendors all at once. Well, of course, you can add any vendors by selecting the new vendor button one by one, but another really cool trick here is if you click the small drop-down arrow next to the new vendor button, you can actually import vendors into QBO. Now, this import allows you to upload an Excel file or CSV or select a Google Sheet. And then essentially you'll choose to map your data into QuickBooks. Choose the data that might be present here on, for example, I have an Excel file of my vendors, so you can choose which columns in this Excel file go where in QBO. And that's a really great way to be able to bring in a bunch of vendors all at once. And note, when you import your vendors, it doesn't actually overwrite what's there. It's just going to add to that existing data. So note that if you need to take people away, you should still make them inactive one by one, but it is possible to add a batch of vendors in a group. Now, a really cool feature of QBO is that the vendors list is really customizable. This is one of my favorite features here in QBO. Above the vendors list, specifically above the action column, you'll see some tiny little icons here on the right-hand side. The print icon allows you to print out this list. This small box with the arrow allows you to export this vendors list to Excel, or you can even change the columns that you see here by selecting this mini gear icon. This allows you to add to or take away from the columns that you have. So let's say, for example, we don't want to see phone numbers anymore. I can uncheck that box and that column disappears here from the vendors list. So again, it's entirely customizable. It's all up to you. And another really cool thing here is if you select a vendor, you can start getting this vendors list to look a lot more like desktop. Selecting a vendor sort of zooms in on them, so you can see additional information like their transactions in the transactions list, or if you click over to vendor details, this shows you that personal information that you've put in about this vendor. But even cooler, if you notice this small hamburger menu, the slider menu, if you will, and you select it right next to the vendor's name, the vendor's name, we have just transformed this list into looking a lot like desktop, right? We've got all our vendors that we can scroll through and choose from on the left. And as we scroll through them, we'll be able to see additional information about each one, just like in desktop. So here in desktop, I've got all my vendors to the left with their balances or our balances with them. And we get our transactions list as well as general information about them on top. And exactly the same here. All our vendors to the left with our balances with them, and all of their transactions over here to the right-hand side. Just note that in QBO, it's 2 clicks to get here because you have to click to open the vendors list and then click specifically on a vendor's name. But I like this view because it looks exactly like desktop. Very easy to see. Awesome. So our vendors are who we spend our money with. Now that we know where to find them and we know more information about them, how do we actually record transactions with them? Well, in QBL, you will get this plus new button, and that is our global create. This is how we create any new transaction in QuickBooks. And you'll notice under the vendors heading, or if you're located outside the United States, this might be called suppliers. You'll see all the vendor facing transactions that we have. Pretty great. But the question is, which transaction do you choose? Some of them are the same as desktop, but some of them are different. So let's back up a little bit and let's go ahead and review our money out workflow in desktop. Now, when we're talking about money out in desktop, we have one very important question to ask ourselves. Does the vendor give us time to pay? And we can answer that question with the yes or no answer. Let's explore the yes side of this workflow first. If the vendor gives us time to pay in desktop, we need to make sure here that we're tracking accounts payable. If we're not, we'll just go to the other side of the workflow. But if we are tracking accounts payable and the vendor gives us time to pay, we will enter and pay a bill, just like desktop. Well, actually, that workflow is exactly the same in QBO as well. So to show you, if we select the new button, guess what? Under the vendors heading, you'll see a bill right at the top. Now, this might look a little different than QuickBooks Desktop. However, it's very useful because all the transaction forms in QBO are going to look pretty much the same. In desktop, your transactions look different from one to the other. But in QBO, all you have to do is learn one transaction layout, and then you can record pretty much every transaction you need. So all you need to know to record a transaction is a who. And here on our bill, that's going to be a vendor. This is who we have to pay. I'll select A1 rental here. Now our when is the bill date. This might also be called the invoice date. If you receive an invoice, you have to pay in the real world. So I'll just go ahead and type in our bill date here. Now there are a few fields that the bill date affects. For example, our terms. Terms are the agreement between you and the vendor on how long it's going to take you to pay this bill. So if I have net 10 terms, QBO will automatically calculate that due date for us based on this bill date, just like desktop. Very cool. Now we also need to make sure that we're typing in our bill numbers. These are invoice numbers according to the invoice that you receive in the real world. Now, finally, moving down here in the middle of the screen, you'll see the activity table. This is the other big section that we need to enter data into. So under the category, that is our what. What are we buying? In QBO, the word category and the word account are interchangeable. So in QBO, category just means which account are we using on the chart of accounts. If we click in this field and select the drop-down arrow, QBO actually arranges this so you'll see your expense accounts first, but after that, you can access any and all accounts on your chart of accounts. It's just called something different in QBO. So what am I spending my money on here on this bill? Let's say equipment rental, and I have that set up as an expense account. Again, it just looks different from desktop, but functions exactly the same way. We do have a description as well as a memo field. Those are exactly the same as desktop. And same thing with the amount. This is our how much we are spending or how much we owe on this bill. Let's say I am going to eventually pay this vendor $1,200 for this equipment rental. Now, there are plenty of extra details here that we can record. Like, for example, if we see down here in the bottom left-hand corner, there is an attachments field where we can upload, let's say, a PDF scan of the actual invoice we received in the real world. That is a great thing to do. Use QBO as your digital file cabinet. And besides that, there are even more fields that we could potentially see. The cool part about QBO is that it's really customizable. So I want to show you some of those additional customization options to take these money out transactions to the next level. Like, for example, what if we didn't want to spend money on an expense account? What if we wanted to buy an item, a product that will eventually sell? Or what if we're buying a service that we eventually sell? Let me show you where you can find that. For now, I'm just going to click this tiny drop-down arrow and save and close this transaction. If you select the gear icon up in the top right corner of QBO, this gear gives you a lot of access to global company settings. And specifically, I want to point out that your accountant settings in QBO, those are your preferences in desktop. This is where we can change what we prefer to see or enter general business information. Just like desktop, it's just called something different, right? But specifically, I want to point out the expenses tab, because this is where we can turn on or off certain fields that take our expense type transactions to the next level. Like, for example, under our bills and expense preferences, what if we wanted to toggle on the items table so we're able to record the purchasing of those products and services? All we have to do is turn it on. That's it. We can also toggle on or off tracking expenses and items by customer. So if you do any job costing, for example, you want to track income and expenses for a specific customer, you can toggle this on or off. You can even make expenses and items billable. And another cool part about QBO is that all we have to do is check the checkbox next to markup, and we can even set a default markup rate right here in our preferences, very similar to desktop, right? Just make sure if you make any changes here in your accountant settings, you select save. So that way QBO remembers the choices that you have. Now, besides that, there are even other expense-related accountant settings that you can turn on or off, like purchase orders. Purchase orders can definitely be recorded in QBO. We just need to turn them on here in our settings. So I toggled that on. I'll click save. And finally, messages. This is the default message that will be included, or AKA the default email that includes your POs when you send those purchase orders to your vendors. And cool thing I want to point out, you can actually CC yourself automatically on any POs you email to your vendors just by checking this checkbox. Email me a copy, and it'll happen as soon as you email those POs. Very cool. All right, so to save what we did, I'm going to click done. And let's go back into our bill and see how things have changed. So under vendors, in the new button, I'm going to select bill. Now we're going to see a whole lot more. Under our category details, we can see a billable column. We can even see a markup percentage column and a customer and project column. And if we expand out the item details section, we can actually record products and services that we are buying products and services. Very, very cool. So to break this down one more time, let's record a second bill here for Bonnie's gardening services. Let's say that bill we want to record today, and let's rent some equipment. So I'm going to go through here and select our equipment rental expense account. And let's say we're spending $1,000 on equipment rental, but I want to assign this to a customer or a project. Well, here under my customer, Dietrich Motors, I have a project automatically set up, and I can even select to make this billable or add a markup percentage. And we can go even further than that. I can also record the purchases of items. So let's say I'm going to buy some cedar doors, and let's say we're going to buy 5. We rented some equipment, we bought some cedar doors, but I can still add a customer and project right there to that expense. Very cool. So let's go ahead and hit save and close here. And I want to show you where you can track those expenses that we just put that customer and project on. Now, this is more related here to money in. You got a little bit of an example of what this was in the webinar that occurred on money in last week. But to show you how this works with money out, on your nav bar, you have a section called projects. This is where you can track the projects or the work that you do for different divisions of a customer. So I've got this arts parts warehouse set up for our customer Dietrich Motors. When I select them, I can instantly see a comparison between the income and the costs. And that's because not only have we recorded income transactions like an invoice, but we just recorded that bill, which brings up our costs for this project. This really helps us with job costing. And we can even click to see specific project reports like the project profitability to be able to track if we're making or losing money on this project. So whenever you're recording your expenses, don't forget you have those options to add customers onto them if you need to be able to track this helpful information. Just quick side note here for you, the projects feature is only available for QBO Plus and QBO Advanced. All right, so we've entered some bills into QuickBooks. What is our next step? If we circle back to our money out workflow, once we've entered a bill, we pay a bill, right? That closes our bill, that helps track accounts payable smoothly, and it's exactly the same in QBO as well. Once you have entered bills into QuickBooks, you can pay them by selecting this plus new button, and then under the bill, you'll find the pay bills window. Now, I know this window probably looks a little overwhelming, so let's take a tour of what we're seeing here. First, at the top, you can select your payment account. I'm going to be paying here out of my bank account, but you can also select to pay out of credit card accounts if you would like. You can also specify the payment date, and if you're paying from a bank account, you can enter your check number or even print checks directly from QuickBooks. Now, the rest of this window is going to function very similarly to the Pay Bills window in QuickBooks Desktop. So to select a bill for payment, you can check the checkbox next to that bill and then specify in the payment column how much you're choosing to pay towards that bill or enter the full amount here. You can also add credits if you were to type in a vendor credit, and you'd be able to see if there's a credit available in this credit applied column. To complete this process, I'm going to click this small drop-down arrow next to Schedule Payments Online and select to save and close. But another really cool thing about QBO, again, it's very customizable. So the best way to see all your bills and pay them all at once is through that Pay Bills window. But you can also pay bills just as easily through the expense or check windows. Let me show you an example. I have an open bill for my payee Brosnahan Insurance Agency. So if I open this check and select that vendor, QBO actually pops out a drawer on the right-hand side that says, hey, you've got a bill available for this vendor. You want to actually turn this check into a bill payment? And if you do, all you do is click add, and boom, QBO just transformed this check transaction into a bill payment for this one bill. That's a little bit easier than how desktop handles bill payments, so you've got a little bit more flexibility here in QBO when it comes to paying your bills. Now, I'm going to leave without saving here. Purchase orders in QBO work in exactly the same way as desktop. Just don't forget to turn them on in your gear icon and then your accountant settings, just like we looked at a few minutes ago. So to show you what a purchase order in QBO looks like, we're going to click the plus new button, and that can be found under the vendors heading as well. New purchase order. And just like any other transaction, we still need our who, when, what, and how much. And look at the beauty here of this transaction form. Looks almost the same as our bill. In fact, if we're not reading carefully and we see the words purchase order across the top, we might actually confuse this for a bill transaction. I personally like that because we're not having to learn a new language every time we open a new transaction. We just have to be a little careful since all these transaction forms look more or less the same. So let's record a purchase order. Our who's going to be our vendor up at the top left corner. And let's say here, I am going to be buying something from Bonnie's Gardening Services. And let's say here we have a purchase order date. So that can be today. We can also choose a shipping address. And if we're shipping directly to a customer, aka drop shipping, we can select a customer from this drop down as well, just like you can in QuickBooks Desktop. And then when we scroll down, we can either enter a category, aka the account on the chart of accounts, or in the item details field, we can select to have a product or service be applied here. So let's say I'm going to be buying 5 glass doors from Bonnie's Gardening Services. I can just use the item details field. I can mix and match that with the category field. And I don't even have to add the customer or project. We can if we want to, but it's all up to us. Again, just like QuickBooks Desktop. So when we click save, this is now saved in our books. But remember, purchase orders are non-posting transactions, meaning they don't affect your bookkeeping. We actually have to turn this purchase order into a bill if we want it to affect our books. Again, that's just the same as in desktop, just the buttons are in a different place. So let's say we do want to turn this purchase order into a bill. I'm going to click copy to bill right here next to the bill, the purchase order amount. And all of a sudden, we have now transformed this transaction into a bill where we can see all of the same details. And QBO even tells us that there's one linked purchase order. We can click on that hyperlink up in the top left corner and go back to the purchase order anytime if we would like. Now, I want to save and close and show you another cool thing about QBO. A question I get very often is, how can I access my most recently recorded transactions in QBO? Well, you can actually do that by selecting this magnifying glass here at the very top of your screen. And this shows you your last 10 recorded transactions. So for example, here's that purchase order we just recorded. All I have to do is click on it and I open it back up. Very awesome. Now, what you'll notice when you copy a purchase order over to a bill, this status right here underneath the vendor name automatically gets marked as closed, but you do have control over whether the status is closed or open and can come back here anytime you'd like. Now, one quick warning, purchase orders in QuickBooks Online are not quite as flexible as they are in desktop. However, the core of our workflows remains the same. And again, you can copy it over onto a bill. Perfect. So let's circle back here to our money out workflow. In desktop, if our vendor gives us time to pay, we can enter and pay a bill and even have that be compounded with us entering purchase orders. But what happens if we just pay for something on the spot? What happens if the vendor doesn't give us time to pay? Well, in QuickBooks Desktop, we have 2 other transaction forms that we can use. And it's based around one question: do we pay in the real world with a bank account? If we do, we need to use the write checks window, right? We're all familiar with how that works in desktop. If we don't pay with a bank account, then are we paying with a credit card? And if we are, then we use the enter credit card charges window. Again, we are all very familiar with how those transactions work in desktop. So how does that translate over to QBO? And actually, this is the biggest difference when it comes to money out between desktop and online. So let's transform our workflow. In QBO, the workflow is the same if the vendor gives you time to pay. That's what we just saw with entering and paying bills. But if we don't have time to pay, if we just pay for something on the spot, we're going to ask ourselves a different question. Did we pay this with a physical check? If we did, then in QBO, we're going to choose the check transaction form. Yes, in QBO, there is a unique transaction form that just is to record your physical checks. Everything else, no matter the form of payment, we are going to use the expense transaction. In fact, the expense form is the most used money out transaction by far. So regardless of whether we're paying this with a credit card, debit card, EFT, ACH, paying with cash, paying with a wire, and any other form of payment except for a check, we'll use the expense form. Now let's jump back into QBO and take a look at both of these transactions. First, I'm going to record a check. So let's click this plus new, and under the vendors heading, you'll see the word check. Again, we want to use this transaction form whenever we have a physical check. So just like any other transaction, we're going to enter our who, when, what, how much. Let's write this check for Alana's translating services. I write checks under our bank account here, our Chase checking account, and our payment date, I'll just have that be today. Now, what am I paying for? I'm going to use the category field here. I'm going to use my advertising expense account, and let's go ahead and enter our how much, our amount. You'll notice though, here on this check transaction form, you actually get a check number. So if this is a handwritten check, then you just want to copy whatever the handwritten check number was in the real world, copy that into QBO, or you do have the option to print checks directly from QuickBooks. If you check this print later checkbox, you can actually go ahead and print this from a unique list, which I'll show you in just a second, but you can also print this on the spot by selecting print check down here at the bottom of your screen. Again, just match what's happening in the real world. And one quick note that's special about QBO, this check transaction form is actually the only money out transaction that can be printed, besides a bill payment, and then you choose check. You cannot print an expense form. So if you're paying with a check in the real world, be sure you use the check form here in QuickBooks. Now, let's say we needed to print this later, but we didn't print it on the spot. If I save and close and go back to the new button, under the vendors heading, you'll actually get a unique window to manage the printing of your checks. It's just this option here that says print checks. You can even print a sample to make sure everything's lining up on your printer okay. And from there, you can choose which checks you'd like to print. Very interesting. So those are our checks. Every other form of payment, no matter what it is for money out, and actually one of the most flexible transactions in all of QBO is our plus new expense transaction. Expenses are very, very flexible, pretty customizable, and you just want to make sure that you're matching the real world whenever you use this transaction. Also, make sure that when you're entering these money out transactions, you're always thinking about your goal. What do you want to see on your expense reports or purchasing reports, and enter that onto your transactions in QBO. This expense form, we still need our who, when, what, how much. So I'm going to start with our who. I'm going to pay Pizza Dallas today. I can choose my payment account. If we're paying with something like a debit card, an electronic form of payment like a wire, anything like that, we can select the appropriate bank account, but you can also select a credit card account if you are paying with a credit card. In this case, I'm going to pay with a debit card for my Chase checking. We'd still need to enter our when, so just match the real world there. To give you a little bit of extra information, you can also select your payment method. I'll choose debit card. That field is optional, but it does give you better reporting when you fill in information like payment method. And same thing with the reference number. If you have a reference number or a method of payment like debit that you like to enter there, you can go ahead and do so to give you the most complete reporting. And then finally here at the bottom, this is going to look exactly like our money out transactions. We've got category details as well as item details. Now, in my case, I am spending my money on meals. So let's use our meals expense account. And I spent $25 on a pizza here. Also, I highly encourage you all on your expense transactions to use your memo and attachments field. Specifically, the attachments field is great because it's the perfect place to store your real world receipts, which is very interesting here. If we want to use QuickBooks as our digital file cabinet, I highly recommend using this attachments field so you get instant proof that what you're entering into QuickBooks is exactly the same as in the real world. Perfect. So once we save and close, congratulations, we have gone through our full money out workflow. But I have a couple more things I'd like to show you here. One of the other excellent features of QBO is online banking. aka bank feeds. In my opinion, QBO's biggest strength is with online banking, or QBO's bank feeds. It's called online banking, and it can really help entering your money out transactions as swiftly and efficiently as possible. You can get to online banking on your nav bar, selecting banking, or this might be called transactions for you on that nav bar. Either way, if you click on banking or transactions, this takes you right to bank feeds, aka online banking. In QBO, you can connect bank accounts and credit card accounts to QuickBooks and instantly download your transactions. As we can see, I have a bunch of transactions to categorize here. Now, most of the time, if you're recording sales in QuickBooks, you still want to record sales transactions manually, right? Because you want details about the products and services you sell, about aging information, about sales tax, all of that. But you don't always need that much detail for money out. So I highly encourage you guys, if you connect your bank electronically, at least for some money out transactions, aka money spent in this column, use online banking. It might help you save some time and still allows you to put in some great data to help manage your expenditures. A lot easier to handle it here. Now, I'm going to give you a quick overview all about online banking. However, next week, 1 week from today, we are going to have another webinar in this Desktop Migrator series that is specifically dedicated to online banking. So I'm going to pop a quick link in the chat. If you're interested in signing up for that webinar, which I highly encourage each and every one of you to do, go ahead and click on that link that I just sent you in the chat and sign up for next week's webinar about online banking. It'll show you a lot more than I'm about to show you now. And for us now, let's go ahead and take a look at how this can help us specifically with money out. We'll see all these cards for our connected accounts here at the top of the screen. For example, my Chase checking account is connected to QBO. And then under this For Review tab, we'll see all the transactions that have been downloaded from our bank. Think of this as our waiting room. Transactions are waiting here for us to take some sort of action on them, adding them or matching them. And again, you'll get a lot more background about that in the QBO online banking webinar next week. For now, I just want to point out a couple of things here. Like, for example, I've got a transaction downloaded from Tim Philip Masonry. It's money I spent in the amount of $680. If you click on a transaction, you have the option right here to enter the vendor that you spent your money with and to select the appropriate category, the expense account or cost of goods sold account. And QBO is actually really smart. There's some AI, machine learning involved here. So in online banking, QBO actually learns from the transactions that you categorize here and tries to help you out by pre-applying things like categories or names to these transactions going forward. So without me ever having to come in and do this work, my vendor, Tim Philip Masonry, has been automatically applied, as well as the correct category here. So we just need to review to make sure this is correct. And if it is, we can go ahead and click Add. That takes this transaction away from this For Review bucket, and it adds it to the Categorized tab here in the middle. And the beauty of using online banking is that QBO actually records a transaction for us, just like in desktop. So for example, that Tim Philip Masonry, we can see here the expense that QBO just created for us by us adding that to our books. And you'll notice here, this is a really cool feature of QBO. We don't have to question whether this transaction was added or matched through online banking, because check it out. Up in the top left corner, you'll see this blue hyperlink that says One Online Banking Matches, where we can instantly click and see that downloaded data from the transaction we just added in our bank. Very useful. Now, besides just adding new transactions, online banking can also help you match transactions. So for example, let's take a look at this first one with this one match found. When I click on this transaction here, the transaction detail or bank detail that was downloaded was for our A1 backhoe rental. QBO automatically matched that to actually the first bill we entered here in class today for A1 rental. It has the same amount, the same date, the same details. So QBO is smart enough to match money spent with a bill or money received with an invoice. Very useful to add matches. So all we have to do now is just review this, make sure it's matching to the correct thing, and select match. And when we do that, we'll be able to see that again in the categorized bucket. But QBO does some really cool things. We can see that if we click the magnifying glass. If we go back to the original bill, QBO actually automatically marks the bill as paid and even shows us that there's been one payment made. Now, we didn't come in and do this. QBO did this for us automatically. And like I said, since it's automatic, if we go back into the magnifying glass, QBO actually records our bill payment for us and says there's one online banking match. Very useful, very helpful, and it certainly saves you time when you're recording those money out transactions. Now, online banking is very smart. And like I said, it's a great place to play around. So be sure to check out that incredible webinar next week for a much more detailed overview of our online banking center. For now, I just wanted to see how useful this can be in tracking your money out transactions. All right, everybody, we are almost done here. To wrap up, though, now that we've recorded all these different money out transactions, I want to talk about one of the most important parts of bookkeeping, analyzing the data you put into QuickBooks on reports. Reports are super useful, and we've got a lot of choices for reports in QBO. We can access all of our reports in QBO by selecting on our nav bar this Reports tab. Now, this Reports tab is basically the same thing as your Report Center in Desktop. You'll notice a search box across the top where you can search for the report that you need. And if you scroll down, you'll be able to see some favorite reports here at the top. And you'll also be able to see different groups of reports with different reports that fall into that group below it, just like in the Report Center and Desktop. So for example, our business overview reports, all of these tell us about our business as a whole. Very interesting here. But if you scroll down even further, you get two whole groups of reports that tell you about your money out. There's a group of reports called What You Owe that help us track those expenditures. But there's also another group called Expenses and Vendors that help us key into what we're seeing here. So I want to point out a couple helpful reports that might feel familiar. They just look a little different compared to Desktop. Now, one of the most used reports under the What You Owe group would be your Accounts Payable Aging report. Like, for example, the Accounts Payable Aging Summary. This report is exactly like it is in QuickBooks Desktop. It lists all our vendors here to the left, if we have a current open balance with them, and if we have an overdue balance with them, as well as how overdue we are. Plus, we get totals here on the right-hand side. And just like in Desktop, reports in QBO are clickable. So if you're wondering, hey, how much do I owe to Brosnahan Insurance Agency? Why am I 61 to 90 days overdue there? If you click on that small number, QBO narrows itself down to give you a detailed version of the report, and you can even click on the individual transaction in that detailed version of the report as well. Again, just like Desktop. And here at the top, you'll see a back to report summary option that you can click anytime to take you back to seeing your summary report as a whole. So definitely play around here with your accounts payable aging reports if you use bills. And speaking of bills, another really useful report to help track what you owe on your bills. Under here on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an unpaid bills report. In Desktop, that's the open bills report. And this shows us the same thing as the accounts payable aging report. However, instead of being split out by aging period, now it's split out by vendor. So for example, Arts Parts Warehouse, I can see I owe them money on one open bill, or Bonnie's Gardening Services, I have two open bills here. So same exact details, just in in a different order. Very, very useful. Now, another report that's often overlooked, but that I find to be very helpful under what you owe, it's called the Bills and Applied Payments Report. Think of this like a quick report in QuickBooks Desktop. This lists out transactions, except this is almost more focused because it shows each of your vendors, if you've made a bill payment for them, and which bills were paid within that bill payment. Super cool. So for example, here for A1 rental, I can see I've recorded one bill payment for this bill, number 449. So anytime you're trying to track what's a part of what, this report is usually a great place to start if you're looking to examine bills and your bill payments. Very, very useful. But we're not done yet. Let's check out some other helpful reports that might help you track your money out. So for example, here under your expenses and vendors heading, another really great report to help us monitor these expenditures are the expenses by vendor summary report. This is helpful because no matter how you spend your money, if you've used those money out accounts like an expense account, this will show up on this report. So it lists our vendors and it lists the totals that we've spent with them. And again, we can drill down even further by clicking on a total and seeing the transaction detail that makes up that number. This is a great way to monitor your expenditures, especially with different expense accounts. Now, another one here, and I'm actually going to use the search bar to find it. Do you use purchase orders? There is an open purchase order detail report, or the open purchase order list, that actually shows you any purchase orders that you've recorded that have not yet been closed. And this is a super helpful way to see, once you click on one of these open purchase orders, have they been copied to a bill? If they have this copy to bill option, that means they have not been fully copied to a bill. So if you use purchase orders in your purchasing workflow at all, I highly recommend monitoring that open purchase orders list. And again, use your search box to get there quickly. The second you start typing purchase orders, that will pop right up. Now, further on that, do you buy products and services? Do you record items on your bills, expenses, or checks? If you do, you may want to use these reports, the purchases by product service detail. This is the same thing as the purchases by item detail report in desktop. It shows us which items we've bought, with whom. We get a memo, we get a quantity, a rate, all kinds of useful information here. So that can really help you track when you are buying something with a vendor and you're using your products and services there. Very helpful. It just looks a little different than desktop. That's it. Now, one final report I want to walk you through is actually a list report, because it's the same thing here as it is in QBO as it is in desktop, and that is the vendor contact list. This report summarizes our vendors list and shows all that important contact information that we've populated for them here. Now, this is helpful on its own, but it can be even more helpful when we examine some of the customization options that QBO has for reports. Now, unfortunately, QBO's report customization isn't quite as powerful as desktop, but I do want to point out here that on any report, in the top right corner of the report, you can always email this report, which attaches the report as a PDF or an Excel document. You can choose to print out this report, or you can export this report to, for example, Excel, a PDF, or Google Sheets. You can also change the columns that appear on this report by clicking the mini gear at the top of the report. So let's say, for example, again, maybe I don't want to see phone numbers. I can uncheck that column here, and QBO will rearrange itself to remove that for us. Or if we click the gear icon, we can click show more to see a lot more options for columns that we could potentially add. So that's where you can add and take away content that appears on this report. We can also click this Customize button here in the top right corner. And that allows us to change a lot. This is pretty much where all of our customization options are for QBO reports. Like, for example, under the General tab, we can choose how numbers appear or how our rows and columns are grouped. We can even change filters, which narrows down the results we see on this report. Now, just a full warning, QBO does not have as many filters in desktop as in desktop. However, the filters that are here are important, so you can still play around with them. And last but not least, here under header and footer, you can change what appears at the very top and the very bottom of the report. Or, cool thing in QuickBooks Online, you can just click into certain fields to change them, and QuickBooks will save whatever it is that you change. Lots of power in reports, so use these helpful reports to really help you track money out. And with that being said, that actually brings us to the end of class. Now, we just got a little taste of what QuickBooks can offer in an hour, and there is plenty more where that came from. This is sort of a big overview over what QBO has to offer in terms of money out. With that all being said, though, that does take us to the end of class today. So finally here, thank you so much for joining me in this hour to learn about QBO. I hope you sign out of this webinar today with more understanding than when you arrived, and I hope you're feeling more confident in knowing that you can use QuickBooks to effectively do your bookkeeping. I was so happy to be a part of this adventure with you today. Thank you so much. Be sure to check out our other desktop migrator webinars, and happy QuickBooksing. Have a great rest of your day.